Welcome to the Indigo Podcast, an exploration of human flourishing at work and beyond. I'm Ben Barron of Indigo Anchor and Cleveland State University.
And I'm Chris Everett of Indigo Anchor. For more information, please visit us at www.indigopodcast.com. Hey, so today's episode is Race, Organizations, and the Role of Leaders with Enrica Ruggs.
That's right. We are so blessed to have Enrica Ruggs with us here today. Yay! I'll introduce her here in a second, but this is a huge topic, and we're going to talk about it in a variety of ways. But we're going to talk about kind of this overall landscape of racism. We're going to talk about racism and organizations in particular. And then we're going to try to talk about what can we do to make progress? What's the role of leadership with regard to this whole topic? So I'll just introduce Enrica really quickly. So Enrica Ruggs is an assistant professor of management and director of the Center for Workplace Diversity and Inclusion in the Fogelman College of Business and Economics at the University of Memphis.
That was a mouthful.
Yes. So she earned her bachelor's degree in psychology and a BA in English from Prairie View A&M University, and earned her PhD in industrial and organizational psychology from Rice University. In her research, she examines individual, organizational, and societal factors that influence inequity in the workplace. Her work focuses on the manifestation of subtle forms of discrimination and mistreatment toward employees with stigmatized identities, the outcomes of these behaviors, and strategies that individuals and organizations can engage in to combat and reduce discrimination. Her research has been published in premier academic outlets such as the Journal of Applied Psychology and the Journal of Management. And coincidentally, Enrica is also just super smart and friendly, and we're just so pleased to have Enrica on the Indigo Podcast. Welcome, Enrica Ruggs, to the Indigo Podcast.
Yes, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Ben and Chris. I'm excited to be here. So I am a fan of the Indigo Podcast. So thank you all for inviting me after I kind of found you all on Twitter.
Oh, that's so nice of you to say. And I do want to clarify that we didn't invite you to be a guest on our podcast only because you're a fan. Like, even if you weren't a fan, we would still invite you to join us.
It would hurt our feelings.
It would.
But we would do it. I would cry at night, but...
Yes.
That's good to know.
Yes. The primary criterion for inviting you was your area of expertise. But these other things are just added icing on the cake, I suppose. So, yeah.
All right. So let's get to it, right? So the racism landscape. All right, Enrica, what's racism?
Oh man, that's a big question, right? So I think that when we talk about racism and think about racism, a lot of people think about individual level racism and racist. So this is that idea that individuals harbor these prejudicial attitudes against people who are racial minorities, and in turn, they behave in ways that are negative towards individuals who belong to that group. So, for instance, I don't like Black people, and so I discriminate against them. And so that's the very individual level idea of racism and what it means to be racist. But we also have, and we're starting to talk about this a bit more, institutional level racism or structural racism. And so this is really this idea that systems like our policies, our laws, our practices can have racism embedded into them, right? So they can reinforce and uphold racial inequality. So we see this in our education systems, in our occupational systems. And so this is really what we're talking about when we're talking about systemic or more structural forms of racism. And there's been a lot of attention the last few years talking about unconscious bias, right? And sometimes these systemic forms of racism can occur at a very unconscious level. So we're really just talking about, we have these associations that are sometimes automatic that we make in our mind about groups of people based on stereotypes that we know and that we've heard. And sometimes that can lead to behaviors that are negative towards individuals within that group of people. But we have to be really careful when we're talking about racism. It's not all unconscious bias, right? And I'm sure we'll talk about
Yeah,
this a little
there's
bit.
some people in white hoods out there, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
There's nothing unconscious about their racism.
Exactly.
I mean, that's their whole, weenie boys club is all about being numbskulls about race.
Right.
Gosh.
Yeah. And those people do exist, right? When we're
Yes.
talking about individual level racism, and that's very conscious bias and reinforced in a conscious way. And that's
Yes.
another issue altogether, right?
Absolutely.
One of the things that was interesting for me, and I'm not, I don't know, I don't have a PhD in history. Like, there's so much knowledge to be gained here. But growing up, the idea of racist was, you know, every other hour I'm thinking something negative about a minority group, right? And that the dictionary probably even has some version of that kind of descriptor, right, of a definition. But despite what's going on in lay people's minds and how they're using stuff, there's this whole body of academics that are actually starting to peel apart this onion here and say, wait a minute, it's not just being angry at minorities all the time. Like that's probably like, unless you're one of those weenies in a white hood, that's probably hard for an individual to actually sustain. But there's all these other things going. And so the dictionary is probably not the best place to go to look for information about racism, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that you're absolutely right. So people often think about, oh, the only people who are racist are these people who are actively thinking about how they dislike people based on their race and who are actively and consciously always engaging in these negative acts. But racism occurs in lots of different forms. And so in the academic literature, we talk about modern racism as
Mm.
a form or a manifestation of racism. And it's this idea of thinking that discrimination no longer exists. It's not a problem. So racial discrimination isn't a problem. Therefore, we have no work to do, right?
Wait a minute.
Or,
So let's unpack that.
yes,
So in the literature, I've never heard of this term, modern racism,
modern
right?
racism.
And that's the idea that we can get a margarita and chillax about this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so we passed, Civil Rights Act, 1964. What else do Black people want? And that's really the idea. So people are pushing too hard. They have the rights that they need. There's discrimination isn't a thing, or it's a thing of the past, right? That's ancient history. And so,
Yeah, it's
um,
funny. I don't have any data behind this, but my assumption would be that a lot of the people who probably assume that that discrimination isn't a problem, that racism doesn't exist, are probably not people who are minorities themselves. Just a
yeah,
wild guess.
just a wild guess. I
Wild
mean,
guess.
the data would support that.
Okay.
But I
Yeah.
got to be honest with you guys. When I started coming to this stuff, and my friend Kay in DC helped kick off some of this modern stuff for me, it, I'm used to having a good handle on the major issues in history and life and society. And I'm not going to say like I'm a blameless victim here, but I didn't get a lot of this stuff in my K through 12 and college education. And so when I come to this, I mean, well, I did. I learned about the civil rights movement. I'd go to Memphis. I'm a big student of jazz. I've read a lot of like To Be or Not to Bop, Dizzy Gillespie's biography, Sidney Bechet's Treated Jazz. I'd kind of come to, I was like, yeah, this was a really, really bad thing. But because of this idea of race and discrimination, and then there's some moral questions of who you are as a person are part of this, it gets very hard to come and say, like, I don't know what the heck I'm talking about. This is all around me. It touches all these parts of my life and my education and history. And I don't know, it's a bit of an ego hit, honestly. I mean, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it's hard for some people to come to terms with the idea that racism does still exist and not just in this very unconscious sort of, oh, I didn't mean to do this type of way, but that we have systemic racism, that people are disadvantaged in a very systematic way. And I think part of the reason that it's hard for people to come to terms with this is, what does that mean for me? Right? If there are some people who are disadvantaged for no fault of their own, then we have to think about what that means for the people who are advantaged. right? And advantage not just because they worked hard or worked harder than racial minorities, but advantage because of privilege, right? And because of all of these historical factors that have led to racial inequality and the present things that continue to uphold that inequality that we see.
Right. So some of the idea, and I think at least for me, the stuff that kind of got my inner chimp hackles up, where you start to feel, oh, maybe triggered or flooded a little bit. It's like, am I a moral failure here? How should we think about moral failing as people address this and start to explore this personally?
Yeah. So when you say, "Am I a moral failure?" Do you mean because you don't have the all of the information that racism is as problematic as it is?
I mean, I think there's a lot of that. I know I came out. I'm atheist now, but I came out of the evangelical background, and I know a lot of this stuff started. Well, you haven't done the work. Might be something. Well, coming back to that very legalistic religious mindset, it's like, well, what do I need to say? Like, 5 prayers and read 6 books, or right? It's not that kind of journey, and I think the human psyche can struggle with a destination that's unclear.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that what happens for people is they socially distance or they psychologically distance, I should say, from racism. And they say, well, I'm not personally racist, right? I have um, friends from a variety of different racial backgrounds. So I'm not
Yeah, I have a black
I have
friend.
black friends. I have black friends. And so clearly I can't be racist, right?
Go
I
ask your black friend. He'll probably tell you, it's like, listen, dude, I love you and everything. But shoot.
yeah, so I think that there is this idea, right, that we are trying to make sure that our own self-image stays intact, right? We want to see ourselves ultimately, most people do, as egalitarian and not racist. But when we uphold the status quo, right, that also upholds racism and racist ideologies. And so that doesn't mean that we're a moral failure, but it means that we all have some work to do.
Yeah. Well, and I think what you raised there is how these ideas, especially perhaps if you haven't experienced racism, these ideas that racism still exists and the discrimination is still a problem, that can be rather threatening. That idea can be rather threatening for people, right? Because they're like, no, I feel like things are good in society, things are good, and people just need to get over it. And that perhaps can explain some of the resistance that people may initially feel to the idea that no, there's still a lot of progress that needs to be made in society and in our organizations.
Absolutely. I think that um, for many people, it's what you just said, Ben. Um, we see the progress, and if you've never experienced racial discrimination, it can be difficult to understand that it exists, right? So there are people who say, well, I've been stopped by the police and, they are very nice to me. They don't um, rough me up and things like that. So that black man who experienced police brutality or police use of force, they must have done something because the police just don't do that because they've never had any experiences dealing with the police in which they showed this type of force. And so it's really these two different experiences that people have that can sometimes make it hard to come to grips with the fact that racism does exist.
Yeah, this is a level of blindness that I see in CEOs all the time. You know, what do you
Yes.
mean? Everybody in my company freaking loves me.
Yes.
Hey, Jackwagon, like they tell you, like, you come into the office with your fly down like 30% of the time.
Yes. Yes. And I think that part of it too was people felt like and we did make some progress, right? But when President Obama was elected, it was like you started hearing terms like we're post-racial now. The country is post-racial. And
That's like the Flair from Office Space. Did you ever see Office
I
Space?
did. Yes.
She's, hey, where's your Flair? Well, what do you mean? I'm supposed to have 6 pieces of Flair.
Yes.
You just want 6 pieces of Flair?
Yes.
And it's like the wrong way to look at it is it's like, what's the minimum viable non-racism I can be?
Exactly.
Like, I read my 3 books.
Yeah.
I went to a lecture, listened to a podcast, right? That I'm a good person now.
I'm anti-racist. I know everything that there is to know about
Right.
anti-racism. But it's a long journey. Right? So racism has been around in this country for 400 years. We're not going to solve it in 2 weeks by reading 3 books and listening to one podcast.
That's
Right?
right. That's right. It kind of makes me think about how some organizations have been dealing with and have been talking about these types of issues following the murder of George Floyd. And in particular, the one that's most salient to me is how the Navy has been dealing with it. Because as our listeners know, I'm also a reserve officer in the United States Navy. And, I had a conversation I'm the commanding officer of a unit right now. And I had a conversation with my sailors yesterday about this topic, right? I said, we're going to talk about this, and I want to kind of share what the Navy is saying and so forth. And what have found to be positive is kind of the Navy from a leadership perspective, their approach towards the entire topic. So I just want to read a little quote for you. This is from the Chief of Naval Operations, Mike Gilday. He's a 4-star admiral, top-ranked officer in the Navy, right? And on June 3rd, so not long after the murder of George Floyd, he put out a statement, and he had a video where he talked about this. And if you watch the video, it's very heartfelt. You can tell it's sincere. And he's followed it up with other things, which would lead me to believe that it is. But one quote, one short thing that he said really, I think, spoke to a good way to approach this topic. And here's what he said, and I quote, "I've been in the Navy for a long time, and I've had a lot of experiences. Something I have never experienced, and something I will never experience, is that I will never walk in the shoes of a Black American or any other minority. I will never know what it feels like when you watch that video of Mr. Floyd's murder. And I can't imagine the pain and the disappointment and the anger that many of you felt when you saw that, because it's not the first time. It's happened time and time again in our country." And then he goes on and talks about the importance of listening and continuing to treat people with dignity and respect, but coming to a bigger understanding of what that means. And I thought that was a really good way to approach it. And then he's followed it up with having a task force to look at different policies and procedures within the Navy and so forth. But I think that's a pretty good way, I think, particularly for people who are not minorities to start to approach this as, hey, I just need to listen for a little bit and try to empathize. It's not that I'm going to understand. I'm never going to walk in those shoes. My background and my identity is what it is, but I can do my best to try to empathize.
What do you think, Enrica? Is that baloney, or is that a good way to think about it?
That's a great way to think about it. I mean, the research shows that empathy is really one of the key things that we need when we're trying to change people's attitudes around topics such as prejudice and discrimination. And so I think that that's a very insightful realization to come to say that, I've never experienced this, but I can only imagine it. And so when we think about how to get to empathy, trying to imagine what it feels like can be really helpful. So this idea of perspective taking, and there's a lot of social psychology that looks at this. And so Jane Elliott, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the brown eyes, blue eyes experiment that she did many years ago with children in a classroom, where she had the children break up. Some had brown eyes, some had blue eyes, and treating the students who had blue eyes one day very nice and positively, and sort of ignoring the brown-eyed students, and then flipping that the next day and treating the brown-eyed students very positively and nice, and sort of ignoring the blue-eyed students, and thinking about, okay, well, how does having them do this exercise. How do you feel when that happens? So trying to put them in that perspective and saying, well, this is how it feels when you're excluded in society and you experience discrimination, and it can really help to increase this empathy that he was talking about.
So tell me about changing attitudes. What could you summarize from the literature that we've learned in any of the movements in history where, hey, the prevailing opinion's bad, it's garbage, and we need to change it. And then so what's that project plan? What's the psychology look like? What's going on under the hood there?
Changing attitudes is hard. Right?
It's a big question.
Dang
It's
it.
it's a big question. And so what the literature says is, it is tough changing attitudes. We know how to change people's behavior. And so we see that with things like laws, right? When we tell people you cannot explicitly discriminate against people because of their race or gender, national origin, these types of things. Although we do see different manifestations. What we do see, though, is increasing empathy can help, particularly over time. So, if we can get to a place where we can increase empathy, so with this perspective taking, like I just talked about, and also changing the social norms. And that starts by changing behavior. Over time, it seems like that helps to change people's attitudes on a larger scale. So, if we think about racial attitudes in the 1940s versus now, we would say, at least explicitly on the whole, they seem to be a little bit better, although we still have work to do.
So let me just brief that back to you. So we can't take a surgical dry conversation, right? We actually need some hearts to come along. And one of the way to get those
Yes.
hearts is through empathy,
Yes.
right? And then we also need like some structural things that shift the norms, even if it doesn't fit, force it. If it breaks, it needed replacing anyway, right? So we got to change some laws, like the anti-discrimination laws specifically, to maybe start kick-starting that engine in the right direction.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that if we are waiting for everybody to just do the right thing, then
Oh
that time
man,
will
I just
never.
think of in the military. All right, soldiers, do the right thing. And there's always a couple of those jackwagons that have like, I don't know. They come past curfew. We were supposed to move out an hour ago. Sorry. People don't work that way, right?
People don't work that way, and some of it is these really conscious things, but some of it is because people don't see the problem. Like they don't even recognize the problem. And so they don't know where to begin. And so really putting the structure in place and helping people to change behavior and change the way that they're thinking about things is really helpful.
And I think about that crisis communication episode we did, Ben,
Yeah.
right? Where people decide because they start looking to signals from their group.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. So, one thing I think it's important for us to recognize too is that, we're recording this on July 13th of 2020. And it's no mistake that we thought this would be a good topic to talk about. We were waiting for a little while to do it. I'm curious to know from your perspective, Enrica, first of all, is there something bigger at work in terms of, is it different now? Is there some sort of change that's happening that's more pronounced following, and I'm speaking specifically about following the murder of George Floyd and the protests that happened afterwards? Is there something about our collective consciousness that has changed a little bit? Because that wasn't obviously the first instance of police brutality towards a minority. What's going on? What do you think?
I think that's a great question. And it does feel different, right? And when the protests first started, I thought about this a lot because I was thinking, well, if we look at Eric Garner, that he was murdered in 2014 in a very similar way, and we didn't see this type of action. If we think about Philando Castile and Alton Sterling in 2016, right? And those murders were horrific. You had Philando Castile being videotaped, being shot in his car, and we didn't see the same groundswell that we're seeing now. What I think is different is that people are, and not just minority individuals and the people who've been allies for a while, but more people are becoming uncomfortable with being uncomfortable. So you have this global pandemic that's also happening right now, and people are seeing how that is disproportionately devastating Black and Brown communities. And then on top of that, we have the administration that is sort of stoking the fires, so to speak.
Yeah, they are. Yeah, I just want to say, yes, they are.
Yes. So in terms of the rhetoric, right, around how we're talking about race and racial discrimination, and was that a year or two ago when you had Trump saying there are good people on both sides at this white supremacist rally,
Complete.
and
Nobody can say both sides anymore, even when you need to after that. Yeah, it's horrible.
it's horrible. So you have this culmination of things that I think have been building, and then with the global pandemic, and then seeing George Floyd, and it was such a long time, right? If
Mm.
you think about almost 9 minutes, I just paused for not even 10 seconds, right? It's a devastating long time, and people are just uncomfortable. And I also think so you had more people going out to these protests, and I think that white people in particular saw that going to Black Lives Matters protests were not what they were portrayed in the media in maybe 2016 and 2014. So it's not just that, oh, everybody who went to these protests were looters and rioters. And so the police just had to come out and hit them with batons to restore order.
Yeah, we saw that 75-year-old guy just get, I mean, my 8-year-old daughter is more threatening than that guy was. And just get pushed over. And those guys got acquitted.
Yeah. And so
Ah,
more people are seeing, I think, a different reality than perhaps what they've seen in the past. And so you have this culmination of events that I think does make it feel different than it has in more recent times.
Yeah. One thing that I've been thinking about too is that certainly the trigger for some of the more recent unrest related to this topic was the instance of George Floyd being murdered. Um, but it seems like that, so police brutality is one issue. And actually, if you look at the data, it's certainly an issue, but it's not as big of an issue overall in terms of discrimination as probably a lot of other issues that kind of are under the surface. So sometimes I'll hear people, for example, say, they'll cite the statistics around police brutality and so forth. And believe me, I have a ton of wonderful friends in law enforcement. I think what they do is extremely hard. I hold all of them that I know in very high esteem. But I hear people who come out and say, well, the data don't really, there's not a whole lot of people who are actually killed by police and so forth. So these protests are unjustified. But in my mind, what I'm wondering is, it seems like, yeah, that was a trigger point for these protests, but there's a lot more going on, right? That was being discussed and what was on people's minds. It wasn't just about police stuff. Am I off there, or is that fairly accurate?
That's fairly accurate. And I would say that even if you look at sort of just the police stuff, George Floyd was really a trigger point, but it's not just the killing of George Floyd. It's the overall, if we look at the criminal justice system and the
Hmm.
police use of force. And so there's racial bias in policing just in terms of people getting pulled over and having their cars searched more often, Black people than compared to white people, and sort of how policing is different. And so you have that on top of um, just the oppression that people are feeling. Like I said, with COVID and the unemployment rates being, they were already disproportionate when we look at the cut across race and racial demographics, but they've rocketed for Hispanic communities and also for Black communities. And when we look at the death rates and these and who's also just getting sick, right, from
Right.
COVID, they're disproportionate. And so there are lots of different inequalities that people are seeing, that they're just saying enough is enough.
Yeah.
And we've tried, people aren't listening, and so we try something else.
Yeah, I was thinking again about the little conversation I had with my Navy sailors yesterday, and one thing that I mentioned was, so as of this recording, I'm a couple months away from turning 40. I've been pulled over twice in my life.
Wow.
Once was a speeding ticket that I got when I was maybe 17, I think, and I was definitely speeding, you know. Another time, I think I was maybe going a little bit too fast, and I got let off with a warning and a recommendation to update the expired tag on my license plate, right? Not in neither of those times did I have any fear for my safety, right, in getting pulled over. It was, I was annoyed that I got pulled over because I knew I was driving too fast. But and just coming to the recognition that, hey, like, that experience that I have in my perspective is not the same as what other people have been experiencing for a long time. I think that's kind of I think it's a good recognition for a lot of people like me to perhaps consider as they think about these issues.
Yes, I agree. I mean, so, and I mentioned Philando Castile, who was shot by a police officer in 2016. He was pulled over, at least they had on record, 49 times over a period of 13 years for rather minor traffic violations. So tail light being out, or maybe going a few miles over the speed
And
limit.
that would piss anybody off. Like,
Exactly.
even pick a single year out of that 13 years, and you're just going to be, what the is going on here?
Exactly. And so those experiences are just wildly different. And so, yes, it's the brutality and the fatality of it, right? But it's also what leads up to that, right?
Yeah.
So we've talked about kind of individual level racism, and you mentioned institutional or systemic type racism. Let's kind of move into talking a little bit about this racism in organizations and what that is. What is systemic racism? Like, how would we know it if we saw it? Are organizations racist, or is it people within them? What's your take on those types of ideas?
Yeah. So organizations, many organizations have, it's not that the organization itself is racist,
Right.
but the systems and the policies and the practices in place, right, uphold racism or racist ideals. So it can be the people within them, but a lot of times it's really, this is where we're seeing that structural and institutional racism play out with the policies that we're using. How do we know? I mean, one way to look is to look at our organizations. What's the demographic breakdown of our organizations, and not just the demographic breakdown overall, but when we look throughout different levels and hierarchy. So as we move up the hierarchy, what we tend to see in many organizations is that even if organizations have good diversity at entry levels or lower levels, as you move up in hierarchy, many organizations become whiter and they also become more male. Right? If we look at the Fortune 500 and the CEOs within the Fortune 500, there are 3 Black CEOs right now, and they're all Black men, but 3 out of 500 is not great, right? And we have no Black women right now.
And this isn't like the year after civil rights got passed. This is like, there's been enough time to bring people up. That excuse of, well, that doesn't work anymore, right? Would that be fair to say?
That would be beyond fair to say. Right? So it's not just but I think that's a really good point because people often say, well, it's a pipeline issue, it's a pipeline issue. And my question to that is, well, why do we have a pipeline issue? Right? So it's not that there aren't people who aren't qualified, who are racial minorities, or who can't be qualified. What are the systems in place that are preventing them from getting these same opportunities to um, move in to the positions that they need, or move into the education systems that they need, and to
Right.
move up?
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, it sounds like it's not just a problem for employing organizations, but this goes all the way back down to when you're a kid.
Yes, absolutely. And
Yeah.
that's a whole other topic and podcast that we could spend a
Yeah.
whole time talking
I'm
about
sure.
education.
So a couple items I want to bring up, right?
Yes.
So, okay, great. We got organizations. Organizations alone can't solve this, right?
Or can't solve racism.
Yeah, like companies.
I would say they can't solve all of it, but they can definitely help in the problem, right? So organizations are housed within our society, and so I think that organizations have a responsibility. A
So a CEO that would say, "Listen, I pay my taxes, K through 12 plus college should, go ahead and do the bias training there. I don't want to pay for it." What would you say to that CEO?
Well, if we're starting with bias training, I would say we got a little bit more work to do. That's probably not where we
Or
should
or
be
or
starting.
any of this stuff. Like, "Hey, listen, let society sort this out." What would you say to that CEO?
You are part of society, right? So organizations don't live in a microcosm by themselves. And so, in order for us to better organizations, we need to look at how they play a role in this issue as well. And it's not just that they are the sort of victims of racism, right? They're contributing to it as well.
Yeah.
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 Now, I just want to make Enrica money, Enrica. Like, what a drag, And I just want to say this to CEOs. First of all, if racism didn't exist, you're not spending enough money on your learning and development packages for people. I've been in large IT organizations where they say, "Hey, listen, we've got a bunch of software developers from India. Therefore, we're diverse. They're people of color." And you're like, "No way, man. Every other IT organization already has the same makeup. Like, how come women are only in project management roles and administrative roles? Why aren't they .NET developer threes and stuff like that?" And so there's a structure there. And so eh, what do we learn from the literature and data about the advantage of companies that will just get with the program on this stuff?
Yeah, so actually, McKinsey just came out with a great report that we're starting to see some of the data that's showing the positive benefits of diversity on performance, right? And so team performance, but also individual and sorry, organizational performance as well. And so we're really starting to see. I think that that was some of the pushback that organizations had before was this idea of show me the data, show me that having a more diverse organization and a more inclusive organization really has benefits. And
Which is
you
kind
know,
of would you agree with this? That's kind of a racist question. Not that the person that's asking it is a racist, but that's kind of. Now tell me why we got to be cool to black people again?
exactly. like,
What's in
like
it for me?
how does this benefit us? like, like, who cares that they're only the janitors? Um, and
God.
so having to make this case is exhausting for
Right.
people
And I just want
who
to
are
say
doing
it's
this
so
work.
exhausting that flipping McKinsey had to push a gosh darn report on this. Because fine, we'll ask if you'll just flip and get to done on this stuff, please.
Yes. And I mean, we've known for a while that diversity in teams has positive benefits. I think that part of what organizations were resistant to is that um, it was hard for them to see the tangible benefits, and they weren't making the connections between the intangibles, right, in those KPIs or those key performance indicators. And we're seeing more of that, but even having those intangible benefits is really important. Um, but it's important because, you're losing out if you have racist policies, you're losing out on good talent, right? So there are lots of talented people out here who we may not be hiring because we're not letting them through the door.
Yeah.
Or we're losing the good talent that we have. So not being able to retain. And many organizations talk about this. Well, why can't we keep our talented Black employees? Well, I mean, if there's just one and they are a token for your organization, that's a problem. And so there are lots of different things that are built into that.
A couple things I want to throw out and resonate on this. So people that are CEOs. Now, if you're just in a commoditized organization, there's 5 other CEOs like you, whatever. You're probably not that creative anyway. That's fine. Take care of your employees, do the right thing. But when you got to make decisions at the top of the line, there's not a playbook, right? And we deal with this all the time. Well, what should I do? And they're looking because they came up in organizations where their idea of leadership was monkey see, monkey do with the guy ahead of them. I'm a leader like the bosses I work for, right? Well, now, hey, Jack Wagon, because you're mainly guys. I mean, I guess you could say Jacket Wagon or something, but
it's Jane Wagon.
Jane Wagon.
Jill Wagon. Jane
Jill Wagon. All right. So you got to have a flippin' moral compass. Where is the moral compass in asking what's in it for me for not making sure that everybody in whatever country you're in has the same flippin' opportunity?
Yeah.
That is morally bankrupt.
I agree. Well, and so, Enrica listed a bunch of great reasons why, right, diversity matters in organizations, from a non-moral type of argument, which is, those are all great reasons. But to Chris's point, it's also a matter of doing the right thing for me. Yes. And, what we have recognized, what Chris and I, when we started this podcast, we really wanted to explore human flourishing at work and beyond. Well, guess what? There's a big portion of our society and people in our country and around the world who are not flourishing. And a key vehicle for them to flourish is through our organizations. And so, I mean, I think there is a morality argument here around doing the right thing and about,
if it's all about the bottom line for you and you're paying lobbyists about rah-rah-ree capitalism, well, you're cutting capitalism off from all these people. They don't have a chance to meritocracy their way on up. I mean, it's despicable.
Yeah. And the morality piece is so important, right? Because what we know is that people who are minorities can tell if organizations are doing it just for the bottom line, right? If you're bringing me in just to be the token, and that's why it's hard to retain people, because people don't want to come in to just be the token or to be the quote unquote diversity hire.
Yeah,
right?
stand here for our diversity picture. So
it's like, man, I've been on the website and in that picture so many times because I'm the only person who looks like me.
Yes. I don't want to be the one person who has to tell you about all Black people and all Black things and serve on every committee because you need a woman and I'm like the only one. And so,
which by the way, Enrica, thank you for playing that role for us on this podcast today. You didn't have to. You didn't have to. Two white guys said just like, well, I mean, to be fair, we said, what do you want to talk about? But obviously, what's your research? It's all.
Yes. And I wanted to talk about this. So.
Thank you for taking a hit for the team.
Somebody has to do it.
They do. And you see this in any kind of movement for rights. Somebody like people say, well, protests or change needs to, look this way, and it's like, no, it looks all the ways. You got MLK versus X,
Malcolm X.
Malcolm X, right. Those were different approaches, but sometimes you need all the different approaches. Some people will resonate with the intellectual thing. Some people will resonate with some, a message from the heart. They will ignore the academic. Ways.
I really agree with all of what you just said there, Chris. I would add that in addition to that, I think it's great, especially on topics like this that can be so emotionally charged for us to have the voice of evidence and research behind it, which is why, we came first to a researcher on these topics to give her the platform for it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I was just going to say that then. So I think that Chris brought up the topic, like, what do you tell CEOs about this who say there is no playbook? I say make the playbook, right? And build this into your strategic planning and your strategic goals. Where do we want to be? Okay, so maybe this isn't where we have been, but if this is where we want to go, then we have to build that in and also bring in the people who have the expertise to help you.
Yeah. Now, if they all do it at once, there's going to be a dearth of racism consultants or whatever. And there's a whole business model.
Oh, there is a
oh,
whole,
boy.
everybody's getting tapped right now.
You got tons of white people saying, "Let me come show you how to do diversity," and they're making a mint. God.
And to be fair, there are some white people who have studied this for years, who
Sure.
are really experts and are great at it. But there are also some who just read How to Be Anti-Racist yesterday and feel like they have all the answers to it, and that's not.
I didn't even read the book. I just read the Atlantic article. I got the Atlantic article, so I'm ready to charge in, right?
That's right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But here, let me ask you this though. So should we tell me about this? Like, what do you think about this? And then I'm just shooting off the hip here. So please stone me by email, listeners. We have another piece of information is we've got guys that are saying they don't want to mentor women in the workplace, right? They're worried I'm going to get a harassment lawsuit if I don't promote, or like, all these kinds of inclusives. And we kind of say, malarkey, guys, get in there and do it, right? Now, when we look at this kind of work, if you're a CEO, it says, you know what? All right, I buy the moral argument, I'm in, right? Should they have to wait for expertise and to know everything before they start saying, I want to do better, and start wrestling with these things as an organization, as a leader?
No, I mean, I think that you can definitely start today. And I don't know that they have to become the experts, right? So we don't count on our CEOs to know everything about other facets of the business, right? So our CEO, we have a CFO, a chief financial officer, and a COO. So bring somebody in who is an expert on this to help, or people in who can help with these types of issues and provide them with the resources that they need to be able to be successful to this in these issues.
Okay. Yeah. So one thing that I, just to change gears a little bit, one thing that I became increasingly aware of, I was aware of it already, but came increasingly aware of while thinking about this episode and preparing for it, was just the wide range of academic disciplines and areas of thought that really go into this type of topic. It's you have your training in industrial and organizational psychology, and that certainly is relevant as it pertains to the workplace and so forth. And then we also have, of course, areas of sociology and communications and political science and history, anthropology, right? You could really name quite a few academic disciplines that would inform all of this. And it just seems like, in terms of the trajectory of intellectual thought and kind of, different topics kind of are at different, I guess, places in that maturity, right? And it seems like there's a great need for continued and ongoing intellectual curation around this topic. And it seems like you're doing some of that, or attempting to, in terms of what you're doing with the Center for Workplace Diversity and Inclusion. What's that all about?
Yeah, thank you for asking. So, the Center for Workplace Diversity and Inclusion is really a center that we started about a little over a year ago here at the University of Memphis. That our goal is to increase the research that we're doing around these types of topics, but also around other areas of diversity and inclusion. So we have a number of scholars who are doing work in this area. So really making sure that we're getting out good work, but also translating that work and providing it to organizations so that there are evidence-based practices in place within our community, starting with Memphis, obviously, because we're here in Memphis, but
Sure.
also providing services and information about how to increase inclusion to organizations um, across the country and across the globe. And then the last piece of that, with the center that we're really interested in doing, is making sure that our education is focused on building in more diversity and inclusion. So whether that's in our curriculum, our undergrad and graduate curriculum, but also making sure that we are educating scholars from minority backgrounds and doing our part to make sure that people are getting opportunities that maybe they haven't gotten otherwise.
That's
So
great.
when we look at this stuff and study, it's an emerging conversation, right? Like
Yeah.
even some of the leaders have talked about their own, Kendi talks about his own evolution as he's gone. Like, I mean, the guy's wicked smart. I mean, go get all his books, type kind of person, right? But why are these issues difficult to study? And why don't you think they're addressed as much as other topics in, say, the organizational sciences?
So I think that they're difficult to study in part because people don't want to face racism, right? So and we talked about
Well,
this.
we're post-racist now, right?
We're post racist, right?
And all I
and-
got was this lousy T-shirt.
Right. And I missed the moment where they told us that we were post racist. So, here I am doing this research on something that apparently some people think doesn't exist.
That's right.
But I think that there has been, it's touchy for people. Like we said, at an individual level, what does that mean if we find racism? And also people think that, some people think it's not a problem. So I think that there are lots of reasons why it's difficult to study. Also, quite frankly, within academia, speaking to IO, industrial organizational, specifically in management journals, it's harder to publish some of this work, or it has traditionally been harder to get this in journals, right? For people to see it as a viable, core, important topics that are up there with some of our other core topics like selection and training, and to see it as just important to and integral to what we do.
Yeah, yeah. And I would argue it's probably much more impactful and interesting than the latest psychometric technique to do blah 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 blah, which may marginally increase the validity of your selection assessment or whatever.
I would agree.
Yeah, so
I don't know.
I remember listening to a friend referred me to this podcast about a lady who, and we'll put a link into the show notes because I cannot remember right off the top of my head, but she looked at how many Black people had applied for patents, and she could see these dips in the data. And then she goes and looks at what was happening historically, and it was like the Tulsa massacre. Boom, they disappear. And she calculates all this stuff. She had some, I think, what is it, Pulitzer Prize winning economists supporting her research, saying,
Probably
you've got to
Nobel.
get this out here. Huh?
Nobel Prize. I don't think
Nobel Prize. There you go. Nobel Prize.
Pulitzer's for literature. Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. I'm a numbskull. But anyway, she had top people in her field, and she kept getting pushback on revise and resubmit. Well, is a hanging really is a lynching an extrajudicial killing? And it was like she had to write a second paper on racism just to get the people who were reviewing her research to even understand what the heck she was talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah. Lisa Cook.
Lisa Cook, there you go.
Yeah, I think so. I believe, is she an economist, I believe?
I think
Maybe?
so.
Yeah.
I
So
think so.
there's another discipline that looks at these types of issues. So
Yeah,
yeah.
and I think that this sort of circles back to what we were talking about as organizations being part of society, why it's really important to understand our history. So a lot of times when we're talking about race and racism, people think that in part it doesn't exist because they don't understand the history. And I think, Chris, you talked about like K through 12, you didn't really learn some of this stuff. And we see that as well. And we see that in our theories, right? And in the research.
Or it was sanitized.
Yeah.
Like, was Rosa Parks a nice old Gandhi type figured lady that sat on a bus? Like, I'm hearing no, you know?
Yeah. And so I think that not taking historical context into account in both our research, but also in our practice, right, really does us a disservice to understanding racial inequality and systemic racism.
So we've talked about, what racism is and the racism landscape, so to speak. We kind of made a little bit of a dent in that, I suppose, and talked a little bit about racism in organizations, how this is a very relevant yet large topic as well. Why don't we move now and try to make a little bit of headway and talk a little bit about how do we make progress? What is the role of leadership and leaders in this entire domain of an issue?
Sure. Where should we start?
Yeah.
Is that just the question? Like, how do
I
we
mean,
make
that's a big one, right? I mean, I guess.
Let's lead off with activism pitfalls, right? You're somebody that gives a rip. You just got your first Black Lives Matter t-shirt from Amazon. You're
Yes.
ready to go show up. What are some pitfalls for the newly minted, racially aware numbskull that wants to be helpful rather than harmful?
The recently woke? I would say welcome to the movement. And I think that some pitfalls are being so excited that you think that you know everything, that we're not listening, right? So being so quick to say, like, I have all of the answers, can be a pitfall. For white allies, falling into this sort of white savior role can
Yeah,
be a
tell us
pitfall.
about that. Tell us about the white savior role.
Yeah, so this is this idea of, well, I am a white and I'm here to solve all of the problems of Black people, and I know the way to do it, right? So let me lead the charge because I have the answers and I have the power. And, we definitely want allies to use their privilege and use their power, but context is so important. And not all Black people or other people of color want people to step in every single context, that takes power and voice away from people. And so really being able to listen and understand that movement. And I would say, I guess another pitfall would be sometimes people go the other way into the guilt, the white guilt, and and saying like,
And I've got
oh,
friends that say this isn't a thing, but this is one of the things that can trigger me about the movement is it's like Martin Luther in his room flogging his back and praying about his lack of holiness.
yeah.
But I don't know if that does anything being in the closet, right? And
Well,
crying all the time. I mean, do it if you got to do it, but that doesn't really move the ball forward, does it?
it doesn't move the ball forward, right? And it's, learning and becoming more aware of racism isn't the goal isn't just to have a bunch of white people feeling guilty for being white, right? That
Does
that
it
does
does it
nothing.
matter if they feel guilty? Does their internal emotional content matter?
Um, Not really. I mean, I think that sometimes and not saying like it doesn't matter how you feel, but it goes back to this perspective taking. Like you feel guilty or you feel bad because you just learned that racism existed yesterday. Well, guess what? I've been dealing with this all of my life,
Yeah.
right? And so by expressing this guilt in to a point where it can become exhausting for Black people because now you're taking the focus off of the true issue and making it about your guilt or making it about if you've read The Person I Mean to Be, Dolly Chu's book, and she talks about this. So I feel I want to be a great ally and asking people like, did I do a good job, so to speak, in my allyship?
You're gonna
And
get your post-Protestant catharsis points. I don't know. Gosh, it's
Yeah, no,
but
no,
it turned me off to the movement. I gotta say some of that stuff. There was never a Black academic that turned me off to the movement. But watching a lot as somebody that came out of a strongly charismatic evangelical experience. And this may offend some listeners. This was my journey. You have your journey. Live long and prosper. But I didn't leave that kind of world to come over to this side of some social justice area that I care about to find that same kind of moralizing. You know, if you see a kid, Sam Harris says this in one of his podcasts, if you see a kid drowning in knee-deep water and you've got a brand new suit on, like you can even be hacked off at that kid for getting in that water. But at the end, it doesn't matter. I mean, your emotions don't matter at all. But at the end, it matters that you do the right thing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and what I see, just speaking from my own experiences, I have seen among, other white people who I know, there is a lot of this kind of self-flagellation going on about, I need to feel guilty. You need to feel guilty. And that's how progress is made. And I don't necessarily agree that is the key component here. I think it's understanding and taking meaningful action.
And what was the term that you used for that? What was the term you used?
Self-flagellation?
No, Enrica, what?
What? White guilt?
Oh, is it white?
Is
white fragility, white guilt? Is that the definition for that behavior?
Yeah, white guilt. It's definitely.
And just to clarify, you're saying, hey, white guilt may not be the most helpful thing here, and actually can co-opt what's really needs to happen and go on, right?
Yes, I think so. I think that and the goal isn't to make all white people feel guilty for being white. It's saying, listen, we have a very serious problem with racism, with systemic racism. How do we take steps to get beyond this and to move forward in a meaningful way?
And the truth is that, I believe the latest estimates are that by about 2040, the United States is going to be a majority minority country. Right, meaning that most people, more than 50% of the population, will be people of color and people who are in minority groups. Right. So, so the point being that that is the trend, and I think it just behooves all of us to take a more thoughtful and meaningful and understanding and empathetic approach towards the entire topic.
I agree. And I think that what you just said about being thoughtful is really important, right? So we can't just do this performative work and stay there, right? So this idea of brands just putting Black Lives Matter, right? And that's all. And we just stop
to sell a t-shirt.
To sell a t-shirt or to put the sticker on the window and say that's it, we're woke now, we're fully woke. You really have to do the work to make the structural change, to change the policies and the practices, and at the individual level change our behavior, right? So what are the behaviors that I'm engaging in or that I'm allowing other people to engage in, and not stepping in and saying hey, that's not okay. And that's where we're really going to see the progress.
So you've mentioned the word ally a couple times. What's an ally and why do they matter?
Yeah. So allies, these are really people who are not a part of the group that is experiencing inequity, discrimination. So in this case, if we're talking about racism, white people would be allies, people who care about the plight of the people experiencing racism and who want to really make their experiences better at the individual level and also at the societal level, with being part of the solution. They matter because they often have, well, one, they're not experiencing the discrimination. So they're not in the position of lower status. They often have more power. So if we're talking about white people in society and in organizations, they have more resources, more power, and they are often, their networks are different, right? So they have the connections to the people who have the power and the resources, the ability to change these policies and practices. And they also matter because some of the research shows that for better or worse, they're often seen as legitimate and more legitimate at the individual level when they're confronting racial discrimination and racial bias. So some research looking at confronting shows that when people who are within that minority group who are experiencing the problem confront racism, right, they're seen as complainers.
Well,
Whereas
yeah, of
when
course you want more equality. You just want to take all the power, don't you?
exactly, exactly, you just want all the power. Whereas when
When
white
a white
people,
person says it, you're like, what are you going to say?
right,
Yeah,
like maybe there really is a problem here,
right.
Hmm.
and so
And it stinks that it's that way.
it does.
But it is. It is what it is, right?
It is what it is, and so, but it doesn't have to be that way forever. So it is
Right.
what it is right now, but we can make the change.
So let's talk about, I know within HRC, and I have a lot of nexus with the LGBT community, and, they talk about, so I see this modern discussion happening on social media and with some of my peers and stuff. Well, HRC will talk about, okay, I'm aware now of LGBT issues. And they move all the way down this stepwise progression, all the way to, okay, let's go change some laws, right? Is there
Mhm.
kind of that kind of progression for people as they begin to come out of not being aware of these issues and moving to somebody who'd actually be a helpful ally?
Yes, I mean, I think that the same basic processes occur when we're talking about helping to fight prejudice and discrimination, regardless of the target group. There are definitely some things that are unique to the target group. So if we're talking about the LGBT community versus racial minorities, but the first step is becoming aware, understanding what the problem is, understanding manifestations of the problem, and then how do we move forward. So, okay, now that we have the knowledge base, and we sort of recognize what the problem is, are we able to recognize that in real life? So when we see an instance occur, when we see policies and practices, are we able to say like, hey, this is racist, or there's racism upholding these things. So moving from understanding just like what it is to being able to recognize it, and then having knowledge. And this really builds off of the bystander intervention model of when do people step in,
Mm.
right? And what's likely to happen. So you have to recognize that there's a problem, right? And that it's an emergency. So recognizing that racism is a problem that needs to be addressed. And then you have to have the knowledge of what can I do, right? Like how can I fix this issue, or how can I step in? What is something that could be helpful? And then you have to act, right? So it's not enough to just like know that there's a problem and know what to do. If you stop there, then no help is given, but you actually have to act,
But
right?
you don't start off with finding about it this morning and proposing meaningful legislation by tea time, right?
Well, I mean, who knows if that legislation is, if you just found out about it this morning, chances are whatever you're proposing is probably not the most meaningful thing.
But
Yeah.
if you're talking with a friend, right? You're starting to read, you're starting to learn. You want to share about something that should be near and dear to everybody's heart, really. If
Yeah.
if you're you might not want to start at that far end of that spectrum about legislative change when they don't even understand maybe how the different shapes of how racism, right? Like it could be helpful, I think, at least. And I've had friends that have been very gracious with me. Gosh, the painful conversation as I'm trying to wrap my head, but to take me step by step, right? Do you think that's helpful? That kind of working down that maturity model, assessing who am I talking to, where are they right now, and maybe I start at the beginning of the story rather than at the middle or the end.
Yes. I mean, everybody is at a different place in terms of their maturity and understanding of racism. And so it is really important to understand where are people to know where to start. And there's work to be done at the legislation end or at the policy end. And there are people who have the expertise and the knowledge to start there right now. But it's also okay to be, you know, earlier on in maturity and to listen more and to gain more of an understanding and to also take time to thoughtfully and carefully strategize about what the best next step is. And so, like I said earlier, racism has been around in this country for over 400 years. And so, if we're thinking about this at organization level, to think that, oh, we need to throw together a bunch of policies by next week and implement all of these things without
I
taking
wish it could
careful
be so.
consideration.
I wish it could be
I do
so,
too.
so bad.
I wish it could be so too, but we have to think about what's the long-term goal,
Mhm.
right? And are we doing things that are aligned with that? And so if it requires taking a little bit more time for some things, I think that that's better if we're going to get it right, as opposed to rushing to do something because we're just trying to say that we did something and there's no actual real benefit of it.
Yeah. So some great stuff there, Enrica. Really great stuff. Any other concrete actions that you would recommend or want to see from leaders, people, organizations?
Yeah. So I think that concrete actions, we're seeing some really great things that are going on. So organizations saying, hey, we recognize that we have some issues with diversity and inclusion, or we want to be a part of the solution at a societal level. So I think that that's a really great first like recognition and acknowledgement. So now the concrete action needs to be figuring out what are the things that we can do, right? So what's going on in our own house, our own organization? What does it look like in terms of inclusion here and diversity? And what are the things that we can do? So bringing in, like we said, people who have expertise and knowledge about diversity and inclusion and racism and other facets of diversity and inclusion, and building this into really our strategic plan and starting to implement some of these things, creating some measures. So how are we going to measure progress? So oftentimes that's why we're not really seeing the movement of a needle. We're saying like, oh,
Yeah, there's no metrics.
there's no metrics, right?
No.
Congratulations, you achieved your no metrics 1,000%.
Exactly. And so really just taking some of these steps I think is helpful.
Awesome.
So one other question before we
Yes.
wrap up here. All right, so let's put you in the seat. Yeah, so Enrica, you're a CEO of a 5,000 person organization.
Okay.
You've got a numbskull in your org, right? She's been filmed on social media. Like what was the guy in Central Park who was with the Autobahn Society?
Yeah, Christian Cooper.
Yeah, right. That person's in your organization. Do you fire him?
So the woman, so he was the man, but Amy, do I fire Amy Cooper? Yes.
Right. So now she's out in society, right? She's kind of a social problem. Like, did she just starve to death because nobody will hire her? What happens? Right? Because the goal is, like, and when we think about, like, say, criminal justice, is it punishment or is it reform? When we look at when you've got somebody in your organization that does something, I mean, I'd can her right away. Like, I'm totally with you, Enrica. But now as a society, what do we do with this horde of unemployed numbskulls that are wandering the streets crying because of their behavior on social media?
Yeah, I don't really see that as the major issue, but I do think that you bring up a good point of, the goal isn't punishment, right? And um I think this sort of that would lead us to kind of the same issues that we have, just in a different form. Now, is it reform? Yes, or maybe rebuilding, right? So not taking what we have and just trying to fix it a little bit, but sometimes we have to kind of break that down and rebuild into something new. And so I think that, you know, hopefully we're seeing that, and people can, I believe, make change. So I think that people do things, they can be remorseful for it. She'll get another job.
I mean, I
And
wouldn't hire her if her resume came across my desk. I mean, that would just be anathema, right?
I think she'll get another job.
Oh,
I,
oh, oh.
I don't think that that's a huge issue. Um, but I do think that for organizations that are saying, hey, we really want to make strides in diversity and inclusion, one of the things that we want to look at is, are we hiring people who are aligned with these goals, and doing a little bit of work to see, like, you know, do they believe in these goals, and are
Yeah, and there was
they
such a low
doing this?
bar. This wasn't like maybe kind of racist. This was just completely, you know, it's
Yeah.
like we're talking about implicit bias and all these little small things. Not that in aggregate they're very big, but this was a case of explicit bias, like on video. So anyway. Thanks for weighing in on that, Enrica.
You're
Yeah.
welcome.
And obviously, as we said at the beginning of this episode, this is a huge topic. And our goal here today was to try to add to the conversation in a meaningful way with an expert in the field. And I hope that we've done that. I think that we've done that. I've been very pleased with and just thrilled to have Enrica on the
Thank
podcast
you
with us.
so much. Thank you for coming on.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really great. So we talked about, this whole topic of race organizations and the role of leaders, the racism landscape, racism in organizations, and then followed up with some of these ideas around making progress and the role of leaders and leadership. Enrica, is there anything else that you want to share with the world? Anything that you haven't discussed already?
Yeah, I would just say thank you both, Jen and Chris, for inviting me to talk about this. I would say we're just scratching the surface, right? There's so much that we could talk about. There's so much to do and to learn. So I would say, if people are really serious about being part of the solution, just continue to think about, what are the small things that I can do? And those small things really do add up. And so I'm excited to see where we go next.
Awesome. Well, Enrica, thank you so much for being part of the Indigo Podcast.
Thank you both.
Thanks for listening to the Indigo Podcast. If you like this podcast, please consider helping us by rating us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen, telling your friends about us, having us on your podcast, or mentioning us on social media. Our website is www.indigopodcast.com, where you can access more information about us and this episode. Thanks again, and we look forward to talking with you again soon.